John Calvin on God's Providence, the Sovereign Hand Governing All Things. Introduction. Among the great themes of the Reformation, few display John Calvin's theological genius and pastoral realism as vividly as his doctrine of divine providence. For Calvin, God's providence is not a peripheral notion, a sterile assertion that God knows all things or permits events, but the pulsating center of his vision of God's sovereignty in human life. Providence, for Calvin, is the active, wise, and benevolent government of all creation by the same God who made it. It is the continuous exercise of divine will, through which every event, great or small, proceeds according to God's eternal decree. Calvin's treatment of providence in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book I, chapters 16 to 18, is both sweeping and intimate. It is cosmic in scope, embracing stars, nations, and history, and deeply personal, extending to each drop of rain that falls and every hair upon our heads. Calvin's God is not a remote architect who winds the clock of the universe and retreats, nor a mere spectator of human affairs. He is the living Lord, who holds the universe in his hand and rules all by his will. Providence, therefore, is not an abstract metaphysical doctrine, but a pastoral confession, a truth meant to comfort believers, humble human pride, and cultivate trust in God's fatherly care. This essay will explore Calvin's understanding of providence in 6 movements. 1. The nature of providence and its relation to creation. 2. The sovereignty of God and the rejection of chance. 3. The relation between divine providence and human freedom. 4. The problem of evil and the hidden counsel of God. 5. The pastoral and practical implications of providence. And 6. The enduring legacy and contemporary relevance of Calvin's view. The nature of providence, God's ongoing government of creation. Calvin defines providence as the means by which God, holding the world in his hand, governs all things. This definition captures both divine transcendence and immanence. God is distinct from creation, yet intimately present in every detail of its operation. Providence is not a single act, but a perpetual activity. God did not once create the world to abandon it to fortune or chance, but from moment to moment he upholds, sustains, and governs it. Calvin's doctrine stands firmly against 2 errors: Epicureanism and Stoicism. Against the Epicureans, who imagine a distant deity unconcerned with the world, Calvin insists on God's immediate and personal involvement in all events. Against the Stoics, who posit an impersonal necessity or fate, Calvin asserts the free and purposeful will of a personal God. Providence is not blind determinism. It is the exercise of divine wisdom. He writes, "Nothing takes place by chance, but all things are disposed by God's secret counsel, and directed to the end he has determined." Thus, creation and providence are inseparable. The same God who called the universe into being continues to govern its existence. To separate the two would reduce creation to a lifeless mechanism. The course of nature, Calvin remarks, is nothing else than the order appointed by God. In every sunrise, storm, or sparrow's flight, believers discern not impersonal law, but the hand of their Father. 2. The sovereignty of God and the denial of chance. Calvin's doctrine of providence is rooted in his larger vision of God's absolute sovereignty. Scripture, he insists, teaches not merely that God foresees future events, but that he ordains them. The distinction between divine foreknowledge and divine decree was crucial for Calvin. It is not bare foresight, he writes, but God's will by which all things are governed. This conviction leads Calvin to his famous rejection of fortune or chance. He mocks the tendency of people to attribute events to luck or fate, arguing that such language masks unbelief. Ignorance of providence, he says, is the greatest of miseries, the knowledge of it, the highest happiness. For Calvin, nothing is random. Every occurrence, from the fall of a leaf to the rise of empires, is comprehended within the divine plan. Yet Calvin's emphasis on sovereignty is not fatalistic. The God who ordains all things is not a tyrant, but a father. He governs the world not by cold decree, but by wise and loving purpose. God so regulates all things, Calvin writes, that nothing happens without his counsel. Yet he takes no pleasure in the calamities themselves, but in the just and holy ends they serve. For the believer, this means that there is no such thing as meaningless suffering. Even events that appear chaotic are under divine control. This assurance forms the heart of Calvin's pastoral theology. The believer may not always understand God's reasons, but he can rest in God's character. 3. Providence and human freedom. One of the perennial challenges to the doctrine of providence is its apparent conflict with human freedom. If God ordains all things, how can human choices be genuine or morally significant? Calvin confronts this question directly, distinguishing between necessity and coercion. He writes, "Man does nothing save at the secret instigation of God, and yet he is not compelled but acts willingly." Calvin's argument rests on a robust doctrine of divine concursus, the cooperation of God's will with human action. God works through secondary causes, not apart from them. He ordains not only the ends, but the means, including human decisions, motives, and actions. Thus, divine sovereignty does not cancel human agency, it establishes it. As Calvin puts it, the will of man is an instrument of the divine operation. Commentary on Proverbs 21 verse 1. This relationship between divine and human causation is mysterious but not contradictory. For Calvin, it is enough to affirm both that God ordains all things and that humans act voluntarily and are accountable for their deeds. The tension is not to be resolved by diminishing either truth. To deny God's sovereignty is to make him subject to creation. To deny human responsibility is to make him the author of sin. Calvin accepts the mystery as inherent in the infinite wisdom of God. It is better to confess our ignorance than to revile what surpasses our understanding. 4. Providence and the problem of evil. No doctrine tests faith more than providence in the face of evil. Calvin never minimizes the weight of this question. Indeed, his theology of providence reaches its most profound depth precisely in confronting suffering and sin. He refuses to take refuge in the notion that evil occurs outside of God's will. Nothing, he insists, is done without his will, not even what is done contrary to it. How can this be? Calvin draws a careful distinction between God's will of decree, his sovereign plan, and his will of command, his moral law. Evil actions violate God's revealed law, but still fall within his sovereign purpose. God does not author evil, but he ordains that it exist for just and holy ends. This distinction allows Calvin to uphold both divine holiness and providential control. He points to the crucifixion of Christ as the supreme example. Christ was slain by the wicked hands of men, yet not apart from the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Acts 2 verse 23. In this, we see how God, by his secret counsel, turns even the malice of men to the execution of his own decrees. Calvin does not claim to explain evil's origin, but to interpret its place under God's sovereignty. The believer, therefore, need not fear chaos. Even the darkest events, betrayal, disaster, persecution, are instruments of divine wisdom. God's providence, he says, is a two-edged sword, terrifying to the reprobate, yet a most delightful solace to the faithful. Calvin's realism here is pastoral, not speculative. He counsels believers to rest not in the clarity of explanations, but in the character of the God who governs. When the faithful, he writes, hear that all things are subject to God's providence, they are comforted with the assurance that nothing can befall them by chance, but everything by the direction of their heavenly Father. V. The pastoral and practical implications of providence. For Calvin, providence is not a doctrine to be admired from a distance, but a truth to be lived. It shapes the believer's outlook on every circumstance of life. 3 practical implications stand out in his teaching: trust, gratitude, and patience. 1. Trust in the fatherly care of God. The heart of Calvin's pastoral application lies in his description of God's providence as fatherly. God's hand, he writes, is not only mighty but paternal. Believers can therefore face danger, uncertainty, and suffering without fear, knowing that nothing occurs apart from the Father's loving will. Calvin illustrates this with vivid imagery. The Christian, like a child, holds the hand of his Father, confident that every step, even through darkness, is guided by divine love. This trust extends even to affliction. The believer learns to interpret hardship as discipline rather than punishment. Whatever calamity happens to the believer, Calvin says, he ought to consider that it has been sent for his good. Commentary on Romans 8 verse 28. Such confidence does not eliminate pain, but sanctifies it. 2. Gratitude for God's blessings. Providence also calls forth gratitude. Recognizing that every good gift flows from God's hand, the believer learns to receive all things, food, health, friendship, success, as tokens of divine generosity. There is no part of our life, Calvin writes, in which we do not experience the benefits of God's providence. Gratitude, thus, becomes a daily act of worship, transforming ordinary experiences into occasions of praise. 3. Patience and submission. Finally, Calvin emphasizes patience. Because God governs all things, believers must learn to submit their will to His. We must not contend with our Maker, he cautions, but quietly embrace whatever He sends. This does not mean passive resignation, but active faith, a trust that God's wisdom surpasses human understanding. Calvin likens the believer to Job, who, though bewildered, confesses, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Thus, providence cultivates humility, endurance, and serenity in the face of life's trials. It is the antidote to both anxiety and despair. 6. Providence, prayer, and the Christian life. A common objection to Calvin's doctrine of providence is that it seems to render prayer meaningless. If God has already decreed all things, why pray? Calvin answers that prayer is not meant to inform God of our needs or to change His will, but to align our hearts with His purposes. Providence and prayer are complementary. The same God who ordains the ends also ordains the means, including our prayers. It is very much our interest to be constantly supplicating Him, not that He may change His purpose or begin to will what He did not before will, but that our hearts may be inflamed with a zealous desire to seek, love, and serve Him. Thus, prayer becomes the believer's participation in providence, a means through which God accomplishes His decreed purposes. Far from discouraging prayer, Calvin's doctrine gives it deeper significance. It is the ordained channel of divine blessing. Similarly, providence gives shape to Christian ethics. Because God governs all, the believer is freed from anxiety and enabled to act with courage and responsibility. Providence does not excuse idleness, but inspires diligence. Since all vocations are governed by God, every task, whether preaching, farming, or parenting, is holy. There is no work so mean, Calvin writes, that it does not shine before God. 7. Providence and history, the God who rules the nations. Calvin's vision of providence extends beyond personal piety to encompass the grand theater of history. In his sermons and commentaries, he often interprets political events, wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires as manifestations of God's providential rule. Echoing the Psalms and the prophets, Calvin insists that kings and nations are instruments in the divine hand. The Lord rules the world by His will and restrains the rage of the wicked, so that they can neither conceive nor attempt anything without His permission. Commentary on Psalm 2, verses 1-4. For Calvin, history is the arena of God's justice and mercy. The prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous, though perplexing, ultimately serve His purposes. The believer, therefore, reads history not as a chaos of human ambition, but as the unfolding of divine wisdom. This perspective inspired Calvin's followers to view political life as an extension of divine vocation, an arena for obedience to the sovereign God. 8. The legacy and contemporary relevance of Calvin's doctrine. Calvin's doctrine of providence shaped not only Reformed theology, but Western consciousness. His insistence that all events are governed by divine order fostered a sense of coherence and purpose in human history. It also laid the foundation for the Protestant work ethic. Labor performed under the watchful care of a sovereign God became an act of worship. In our modern world, dominated by randomness, uncertainty, and fear, Calvin's vision offers both critique and comfort. Against secular materialism, it reasserts that history is not aimless but teleological, directed by divine wisdom. Against fatalism, it reminds us that God's sovereignty is not impersonal but paternal. Against despair, it proclaims that no event is meaningless, no suffering wasted, and no detail overlooked by the God who counts the hairs on our heads. Conclusion. For John Calvin, the doctrine of providence is not an abstract speculation, but the living confession that our lives are not tossed about by chance, but governed by God's watchful hand. It reveals a God who is at once transcendent and near, majestic in power, yet tender in care. Providence teaches believers to trust amid mystery, to rejoice amid blessings, and to endure amid trials, knowing that all things work together for good to those who love God. Romans 8, verse 28. Calvin's vision of providence transforms theology into worship and philosophy into faith. It teaches that the same God who governs the cosmos also guides the footsteps of his children. To believe in providence is to see the world as charged with divine meaning, to discern behind every circumstance the wise and gracious will of the Father. In this sense, Calvin's doctrine is not merely about control, but about communion. The sovereign God is also the faithful shepherd. His providence is the theater of his glory, and to live within it is to live within the care of the one who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Ephesians 1, verse 11. Thus, Calvin closes the believer's anxious heart with this serene conviction. Ignorance of providence is the greatest of miseries, but the knowledge of it is the fountain of the highest blessedness.